Hello again, my lovely sunwalkers. It's good to see you all back. We've got another podcast this week. Oh my goodness, such a busy week. So, before I get into the ins and outs of the podcast, just a heads up, I do have those two in person author signings coming up this weekend in Western Maryland. So, get on over to my Facebook and my Instagram to check it out, okay? And of course, today's podcast, we are sitting down with a fellow author, Miss Barbara Mostella. She is a phenomenal writer. I got a little bit of a look into her research process and how important it is to really know your content in your book in a sensitive way. So sit down, buckle up, and of course, stay in for the long haul. Let's get to it. Hello, my lovely sunwalkers. Welcome back with me, Jenna OMalley, and I have another author here today. We have Miss Barbara. How are you, honey?
I am doing awesome. How about you?
I'm doing phenomenally. Thank you very much. So tell us a little bit about yourself, hon.
Well, of course, my name is Barbara Mostella, and uh, I just published my second book, June 18, and this is my second book, and I am a fiction writer.
What type of fiction specifically? Is it modern, fantasy?
It is mystery,
Ooh.
suspense, and murder.
Oh my goodness. So you took on quite the adaptation there. Um, what is the title of both your first and second book?
The first book is Who Would Have Thought, and the second one is it's a series, but the second one, it can be read independently. It
Ooh.
doesn't depend on the first one. So the second one is Consequences of Crime, Greed, and Love.
How different would you say those two are? Like, would you recommend if someone's new to the genre, should they read one first or should they read two first?
I would say read the second one first.
That happens on occasion. That sounds strange, but when they're standalone like that, that does happen. So I'm glad for your honesty. Thank you.
The
So,
reason, excuse me,
no,
the
no, go
reason that
ahead.
I say that is because the second book, both books are dependent upon one character.
Oh,
And that's why I say you can start with the first one. The second book is not, it doesn't have as many pages as the first one. So I think if you read the second one first, I think you would be excited to find out about the main character, who is Alfonso.
oh,
Um, so Alfonso is the main character, so you can read the second one first, and you'll be okay.
that's a good thing to point out. If you're afraid of a longer book, go with the shorter one. I like that advice. Really good advice. So, we have a set of questions today we're going to go ahead and run through, and we're really focusing on your research process behind these books. And we've talked previously, and some of what you do just blows me away, just how you adapt what's in this world to your own. So, the first question I have for you then is what is your research process like regarding just those character names? Because you've already mentioned one character for us.
Exactly. What I do is once I determine what my story is, I pick a state or city,
Mm-hmm.
and once I do that, I get names. I get the most popular names from that city or that state, and
So,
then go ahead.
I'm sorry, where was Alfonso's location then taken from?
Alaska.
Hence the cover then, for sure. Go ahead,
Yeah,
hon.
yes. And once I pick the names as the most popular ones, I look up the definition of those specific names. And the reason I look up the definition, I want to ensure that the definition of those names does not affect my story in a negative way. And I want to make sure that it doesn't affect the overall story. So the names have to have a meaning that's going to be good for the story. So that's why I look up the meaning of the names.
So what does Alfonso mean? Do you remember off the top of your head?
You know, I don't remember off the top of my
That's fair. I understand.
head.
Sometimes you have so many other details that the small ones disappear into the story. I
Oh
get it.
yeah. Oh yeah. That's a good question that you asked me though. So I got to keep that in mind in case I get asked that question again, which is it's a very good question since I gave that definition.
Right. And I think when we were talking previously, I had asked you, would that mean that somebody named Angelique would be a kind soul, who genuinely went out there and helped people, or would she work against that? And do they normally work against it, or do they keep with it?
Keep with it.
And that's an interesting take because you do sometimes see, like, I'm thinking like the rebellious teenager type who, I hate my name because. So I really find it intriguing that you love the positive end of it. And how do city states and their communities or cultures affect your research outside of the names? Because it's just not the name to the area that you pay attention to, right?
Exactly. I also contact the Chamber of Commerce of any of those cities or states. And a lot of people don't know that Chamber of Commerce, not only do they do business in those cities or states, they actually have local information about the customs, special
Mm.
events, any kind of do's and don'ts. Uh, you don't want to go to a state where you've written a book about and there's something negative or some kind of protest. So you want to make sure that that you're contacting the Chamber of Commerce and they can give you a lot of information. And for example, if 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 they have a blossom festival in that state,
Mm.
and then I put in my book that something about a rose festival, well,
Ah.
that's bad because
Mm-hmm.
that could be their source of revenue for that city. So
That's
you have
very
to be
true.
cognizant of what's going on local in that city. So the Chamber of Commerce is one of my main focus of research when I'm starting my story.
Because what it sounds like you're telling us is the Chamber of Commerce just doesn't give you information on local businesses. It's also giving you community information. What are the cultures, the traditions of the area, too? So that's a wealth of information that I don't think a lot of writers that write in modern fiction even consider because your books are taking place within the last 100 years, I gather, right?
Exactly.
And your second book you told me takes place in Alaska. Have you ever been?
I have not been. I have a friend that lives there, and they were able to give me a lot of information that I would not have received otherwise. Um, but I did a lot of research online, and as I said, I talked to my friend quite a bit. He was in the military there, and I have somewhat of a not necessarily military background, but I've worked for the military, so him being in the military kind of helped me to understand the true culture there because he was not originally from there,
Right.
but he moved there, so he had to kind of adapt to what the culture is like there. So it really helped me a lot to understand the people, the culture, uh, and all the important things that are going on there that you would never even think about. All the different kinds of museums and
Mm-hmm.
uh, just a lot of information that you wouldn't otherwise get if you didn't visit there. It'd be just awesome to know someone that lives there.
I kind of have to agree with you specifically on Alaska about that. My husband's grandparents have a love of Alaska. They've never, well, my grandmother in law's never lived there, but his grandfather was in the military stationed out that way when they were right before or right after they were married. So it's quite intriguing to find that that's another author's in is a military connection. And I don't think we realize how our service members are wealths of positive insight into where they've been.
And
So
they're stationed in so many places that we wouldn't even think of.
that's true. And
Yeah,
even if they're there for a week or two, that's something they could fill you in on that you might find wrong online.
exactly.
So, how much in person research, and this wasn't one of our questions, but how much in person research do you think you do versus internet research?
I do more internet research because I try to write about a different state each time I write a book.
Hmm,
A lot of my research is online.
okay.
Um, the my in person is limited, and I've decided that I probably need to do more in person type research because I think it helps the book a little bit more because, like I said, having a friend there to talk to about the first two books really helped a lot.
And you'll learn from those friends little nuanced ins and outs that, unless you're a local or ever been there for an extended time, you just wouldn't be aware of, like what the best bar to go to is.
Exactly.
And where do you go on a Friday night?
Yeah, the best restaurants.
Right.
Yeah.
So, um, some of my books that I'll be writing here within the next year or two are actually take place in Maryland, where I grew up. So I know, even though I haven't lived in Baltimore since 1995, there's people I'm going to be like, hey, this place isn't open anymore. Where do you go for now?
Yes.
So that even things like that, I think, crop up in your research then, where someone who's local to there might be like, well, you do know that place that you mentioned existing in 1980, closed down in 1960.
Exactly. And if you get a chance to go to those places that you haven't been, and when you do, man, it's going to be awesome when I get a chance to visit Alaska.
And you finally get to eat the food that people are eating in your books and things of that nature.
Exactly.
Oh, I hope that's a trip you're able to take soon. It sounds wonderful.
Yeah, I'm planning on. I don't know exactly when,
Mhm.
but it is something that I'm planning. It's on my bucket list.
That's the same for me. The leading character in my first book is Scottish, and my husband and I want to go to Scotland so badly. And I told him, this is basically now a research trip too, right? Yes, I'm sucking that up. Is kind of the response I got. But about how long do you think your research process takes in comparison to actually sitting down and writing then?
I allow myself at least a month. Um, and the writing, it takes about from 2 to 4 weeks. Now, the reason that I allow myself at least a month, it's not like I'm doing research every day, all day
Mm-hmm.
long, but there may be something specific that I may be looking for. It may take one day, maybe 15 minutes, the next day, maybe 30 minutes, or, it varies each day what I'm researching.
And you're kind of doing it as you need it and as it comes to you still.
Yeah, so I'm still building my story, when I'm doing the
Mhm.
research. So even though I've come up with a story, uh, when you start doing research, you find some things that you didn't know that you didn't know.
That's
So
very true.
it changes your story somewhat.
Yes. I had that happen to me while doing some research for my second book. There were a couple of things I was like, thank goodness I left that ambiguous in book one. Has that happened to you, even though they're kind of standalone?
Yeah,
They do still cross over enough then.
yeah, they will cross over for sure.
So, do you outline that? And if so, do you stick with it all the way, even if those crossovers do or don't happen?
Absolutely. I always outline, and I only outline after I have done my research. And so the reason that I outline is that my outline is actually the chapters in my book. So by outlining, it helps your story to flow more smoothly. Um, so even though I have the outline, and these are my chapters, the names of the chapters don't stay the same. They definitely change.
Mm-hmm.
And in my second book, even the title of my book changed. So even though you've got an outline and it helps the flow of your story, those names are going to change because something's going to happen different in your book. Because you're going to, when you start writing, some different ideas are going to come up based on your story.
Very
So
much agreed.
definitely that's going to change. It's not going to stay the same.
And sometimes you don't have a say in how another character reacts to what you had planned for the original character that you're in that point of view for either too.
And
And
you're correct. You're correct. Yes.
I think that some people might recall me mentioning in another podcast that happened to me in my second book. I was not writing in this secondary character's POV at all, and he just up and disappeared. And I'm
Hmm.
like, but I need you. And he's like, I'm gone. Bye. Figure it out. And I'm like, thanks. So has that
Yeah.
happened to you yet?
Well, in this second book, um, uh, uh, my editor Catherine, uh, she thought one thing had happened to my main character, and then I think she was getting a little bit upset about what she thought was happening to my character at the end.
Oh no.
But uh, but actually, it's what I wanted the readers to feel. I wanted them to feel who this author was, and I mean this the main character, and to get engaged with him and just
Mm-hmm.
feel who he was, and but at the end, it doesn't happen like you think. Um, so yes, sometimes things do happen to your character that maybe your reader don't want to happen, but then
Yeah.
you kind of draw them into that character, and they get attached to that character, and that's a good thing.
Did she
And
want to
so
throw her computer when she read it instead of throwing the book?
yeah, something like that. Yeah, because
Oh no.
she thought something was happening to the character that wasn't going to happen, but it didn't happen what she thought. But she liked the end of my book.
Good. I'm very much looking forward to reading them. It's on my TBR this week to finish up. So
Yeah.
if you all want a really good book, because honestly, when our last podcast was, of course, our editor, Catherine, and she admitted up front she likes killing somebody before she has breakfast when she writes. So if you were able to make her enjoy it in the end, definitely worth the read for sure, in my opinion. So I'm so
Yeah.
glad to hear that as a writer to writer or writer to editor and vice versa review. Um, as far as your outline, you said you don't stick with it all the way, but you kind of alluded into this next question. How do tense topics and real life choices of famous people or even just the local quote famous people impact your books?
Well, I kind of look at how I feel about life and what people do, and I have a motto for myself, and my motto is don't let anyone set the tone for your day except you and God.
Yes.
So based on that, we know that there's a lot of things that are happening in the world today that affects everybody's lives in one way or the other.
Very true.
And famous people uh, have a real impact, whether it's intentional or unintentional. So therefore, it's kind of hard to uh, write your book and not highlight some of the things. So what I try to do is I try to stay away from political things. Uh, I try to stay away from politics, uh, and I try to keep the story uh, where it doesn't to see how it actually affects all Americans. You know,
Right.
how would it affect anybody in America, in not just in America, but in other countries as well.
That's a good point.
So, and then I try not to discuss anything about race, because it's such an issue today. So I try to write my book in such a way that when someone is reading my book, that they don't get to chapter 3 and they find something that I have quoted that a politician said and they just don't read the book. So I try to
Correct.
make the book so that they enjoy the entire book, and it's not political. It's not about somebody famous. Um, so it's like I said, it's kind of hard to write a book, even though there's a lot of stories you can write. But you got to just think about, how it's going to affect the people that are reading your book.
And that's something that I kind of also am acknowledging time period wise in my book, because when my books take place, it's British conquest, and part of that for you is your books take place in a more modern time. So you there's two different conversations completely about the same topic. What do you include? What don't you include? And what is your commentary on it? So that's highly insightful, and you carry that thought all the way down to your research process, which is amazing.
Yes, I do.
Um, your as far as your character descriptions go, is there a method that is effective for you and your readers as far as not only how you describe them, but for example, how would you explain a Cherokee Indian person in Australia in 1722? Just an off the wall example, but do you always go for a logical reasoning with that, or is it more what does the local population look like and things of that nature?
Well, um, I just hinted a little bit in this last question about the characters.
Mm-hmm.
What I try to do is I try to describe the characters in such a way that the reader feels like it's a real person. This is
Like
really happening.
somebody that they would know in their family or something of that nature.
Exactly.
Oh, so it's more about their personas for sure, to clarify.
Exactly.
Okay. Um, so you said you avoid politics and things of that nature. Are there things that are essential to character development that you might include? For example, two of my characters are one's a former nun, one's a former member of the Swiss Guard. Do you let that carry on through their whole story arc, or do they go against things that might have been this character grew up in this environment, if that makes sense?
No, it makes sense. I guess what I try to do is for example, like if in one of my books, I'm talking uh about lawyers.
Oh, okay.
So uh, I try to find out everything about what a lawyer does. Uh, because I've never I haven't practiced law. Um, I try to find out what do they do in different states. Do uh, if they practice law in one state, do they have to have a license to practice the same law in a different state?
For example, and this could even be subdivided, I think, because there's a difference between like corporate law, traffic law, court, and things of that nature too.
Exactly. So I try to stick with whatever profession or that character has in the book. I try not to deviate too much away from what that character does and how they interact with the entire story.
So you would not give a lawyer an atypical persona, or you would be mindful of if this person practices corporate law, they can't cover a traffic stop kind of ticket situation.
Exactly. I try to stick with what I'm referencing in the book.
And I think that's something Hollywood and movies get slammed for a lot, but authors who compete at a professional level like we do, we're far more sensitive and mindful to that. And it's really nice to see it carry over, like I said, so deeply into not just your writing, but into your research process even. Um, and we might have hinted on this a little bit already because you said you talked to your friend. It sounds like a little bit more for book two versus book one. How otherwise was writing that first book so different from writing your second book then?
When I wrote my first book, I didn't know anything about writing a book,
I
writing a book,
understand.
or publishing a book. I didn't know anything.
Hmm.
So what do you do when you don't know? You go when you learn. So I went
True.
to a writing, publishing and writing book boot camp.
Do you
And
remember where it was or who it was through?
yes, it was actually through the publishing company that published my first book.
Congratulations. It's wonderful that they offered that to you.
Yeah. And not only were what I liked about the training is that they were offering it to adults and children because so many children are writing books today.
Yes, especially kind of like how Catherine and I were talking with lockdown. Very true.
Hmm. And like I said, I didn't really know much about writing a book. So when I went to the boot camp, I learned a lot about the outlining, the genre that I'm writing,
Hmm.
uh, the cost. Publishing a book can be very expensive if you don't know what you're doing or who you're talking to.
And
Uh,
if you want to compete at a professional level, you don't want to DIY it.
there you go. And then on my second book, now I understand more about uh, the type of writing that I should, what kind of person I am as far as the writing. Do I write in third person? Do I write in first person? Uh, Editing a book. I know more about editing and formatting. I know about marketing,
Hmm.
uh, social media, metadata, all those things I had no clue about writing the first book. So it helps me to write my book better, and it doesn't take me as long writing the second book since I wrote the first book.
Yeah, that's what you had mentioned when we talked previously that you wrote your first book in like 2, 3 weeks, or your second
The,
book like
the
two, three
second one,
weeks.
the second one, it didn't take as long. The first one, it took years to write it because I didn't know anything about it, and a lot of things were happening, in my life. Life happens. I had to take
Very
care
much
of
so.
a parent, so my writing was interrupted. So I didn't really get into a mode of writing where I set a schedule and a time frame and goals until I wrote the second book. So it didn't take me very long to write it. But the editing, trying to edit it takes a long time. But
Yes.
to get it written down in some kind of format where you can understand what you're writing, it only took me about 2 weeks.
That's amazing. So, when you sit down to write, could you describe what your actual writing time is like? Like, do you tell your family, leave me alone? Do you have an office or an area or a cafe you go to and write?
I do have an office in my home, and I said it's just me and my husband. So he understands that uh, in the morning there's a specific time I have set aside to write, and it's normally about 3 times a week. I
Mm-hmm.
don't do it every day because we share an office. So
Ah, okay.
I'm respective of his time needing to use the office. So I set aside specific time. Um, and I try to set aside a goal as far as what I'm trying to accomplish each day. Say I may want to write 2 chapters or 3 chapters each day. So even if I don't accomplish that, I don't let it hinder my schedule.
You just
But I
keep
have
on
I do
trucking.
yeah, I do set a schedule of for completion of my book. Even though sometimes, you don't always meet that schedule, but I
Very
try to
true.
get to it as close as possible. So I do have a location where I write. I set aside specific time during the day, and I also allow myself to not write. A couple of those days, I may not, you know, a lot of things could be on my mind, that I can't really think. So
Yeah, that's true.
I allow myself the time to get away from the writing. So getting away also helps.
And depending on what content or topics you're covering in your book, because even you had mentioned how our editor thought with your last book that it was going to go a different way, I wonder if, because this happened with me with my second book, your own life was kind of on some days on par with I just can't be in that character's POV until I process my own head. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yes, exactly.
And when you have those days, do you feel defeated at all? And like, do you have to kind of remind yourself, hey, it's okay?
The good thing about those times is that it's where the outline comes into play.
Ah,
Even though you can't really think, say I'm on my second chapter, I have the chapter name and what it's supposed to be about, but I may not can get the words together the way I want them put together. So I
right.
don't really let that bother me because I got an outline in front of me. So I
You
can get myself back on track pretty quickly.
and sometimes having that direction pre-planned really does help to combat the bad days too, at least on my end. It's like, okay, you know where you're going, let's go do it, kind of deal.
Exactly.
Um, so I had a couple other questions here for you, but before we get into wrapping them up, did you have any questions for me?
Um, how did you decide that the genre that you're writing in was the one for you?
I've kind of I've been a traditional nerd most of my life as part of it.
Okay.
um, I blame a couple of things. My brothers played Dungeons and Dragons when it first came out way back when because they're much older than I am. So I remember them playing that a little bit growing up. I watched, of course, a lot of Disney movies with dragons and princesses and things, and that kind of led into a love of the same genre for reading and video gaming. And I just fell in love with history because I fell in love with it through fantasy references, basically, and it's one of those things I couldn't escape it my whole life. Why not just take what I've learned from different stories within those worlds and make my own? I also taught public school for 10 years, so I kind of looked back at in what historically trends well fantasy and romance novels. So that was another part of it.
I have one more question I would ask,
Sure.
because this has been kind of toying with me myself. Um, if you were gonna write in some other genre, or have you thought about writing in any other genre?
I actually am also writing my teaching memoirs in the
Okay.
background, and it's completely different. That book is a collection of personal essays that reflect on what it's like being a teacher who started teaching after 2008, what it's like being a teacher, a young teacher when there's so many changes in the standards. One of my essays covers is it appropriate for teachers to show tattoos? And
Yeah. Interesting.
it's also even a collection of poetry because the main focus of the memoir is not just being a teacher, but also being a teacher who has a mental health disability. And we're not looked upon kindly, where you're literally told you're not fit to be a teacher. And it's like, yeah, but do you know how many kids we teach that have the same things we do? We should be
Oh,
teaching so they have someone who's sympathetic.
exactly.
So,
And I applaud teachers
oh,
each
thank
and every
you.
day because it's such a, I don't know exactly how hard a job is, but I just believe in my heart that it is one of the hardest jobs. Because you're trying to teach, you're trying to discipline, you're trying to figure out what's going on with each student in your class. So I
That's
just
what it
applaud
is.
teachers every day.
Well, thank you. And a lot of people don't recognize that it's mostly brain power we expend because I'm making, like you said, I'm watching a bunch of kids. I've specifically worked with students who have reading disabilities for a good chunk of my career. And so I have to remember each student's needs. And sometimes I have a class of 30 kids that I am helping, and it's just the decision making process is exhausting. So
Yeah, I
thank
can imagine.
you. Thank you very much for recognizing that. Not many people do. It means a lot. Um, did you have any other questions before we go on?
No, that was all.
Wonderful. So, my last question for you, do you have any reading recommendations by other authors? Like, what are you reading lately?
Well, what really got me into writing fiction is an author by the name of Stuart Woods. Uh,
Yes.
he has written so many books, um, and here lately, I can't keep up because I'm writing as well.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason that I started reading his books is because when you pick up his book, he gets you in the first chapter.
Within the
Every,
first paragraph.
yeah, every book that I've written, he gets you, and his chapters are not long. So
No.
I have tried to write my books um, in line with somewhat with the way he writes his books. But my problem is that I'm a long-winded person in describing things.
Me
And the
too.
the reason for that is that, because I worked for the federal government.
You're
Uh,
used to paying
so
attention to details because it's
a
not
lot of
just
you got to
covering
give
your behind, it's covering everybody's.
yeah, you got to give a lot of details.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of my weaknesses that I have to work on. And Catherine brought some of that out to me. She say you describing too much stuff.
No more stage management?
Yes, yeah, there you go. There it is. There it is. Yeah, but that is my weakness
Same
in
here.
writing is that I'm long-winded and I want to tell you everything about everything. And so I have
Same
to
here.
work on that. And I'm gonna work more on that on this in this third book. But I don't have a specific book, but author Stuart Woods, that would be, if you're a fiction reader, I would recommend any of his books.
I love his books because, like I told a couple of my students when I taught high school level kids, mind you, they said my greatest problem with sitting down to read is it's so time consuming. And I would offer him if they tended to like those types of movies and things of the same genre,
Hmm.
because I'd be like, you could literally read a chapter on the bus on the way to school.
Exactly.
And a lot of them started downloading ebook versions and things of his works just because they were like, oh, I have 5 minutes. Be quiet. Let me read. Literally, when I had kids asking me, can I pull out my phone so I can keep reading a chapter? I'm like, yeah, sure. So long as I don't see headphones or hear music or anything, we're good.
Yeah,
I'm not going to deny you reading.
you can stay focused just reading one chapter.
Yeah. And, they had 2, 3 minutes before the bell rang or whatever. Yeah, I would rather you read a book and make sure you don't give me lip if I find you not.
Exactly. Yes,
So
yes.
there was the catch 22, of course, but he's just a wonderful author. I don't think anything of his has been turned into a movie or a TV show yet, has it?
He's had several. I think Chieftain, I think it's turned into a movie. He's had several that have been turned into movies.
Really? I need to
And
get on that.
yeah, but they're from the older books.
That's probably why
Yeah,
I've
his
read a
older
lot of
books.
his newer things recently. So,
Yeah.
well, thank you, my dear, for joining me today. Did you want to give a shout out to anybody in particular, other authors or things of that nature you're collaborating with?
I would give a shout out to a friend of mine. Her name is Barbara Johnson. She's writing children's books, and this is her first one that she's gotten at. And I would just encourage her to continue to write because she's a very good writer.
What kind of children's books? Are they like educational, fantasy?
This first one that she wrote is about a little girl in the AME church, and
Oh,
it's about the doctrine of the church and how a child has to learn it. And she does it by through her grandmother. Her grandmother ends up being in her home with her parents. And
oh,
grandparents have a big effect on children's lives, especially when they're close and they're around all the time.
yes, very
So
much
through
so.
through her grandparent, the little girl learns a lot about the church, and it affects her overall life. So that's her first one. I don't know what she's going to write next, but she felt like there was no other books to teach children in the AME church about the doctrines
So
of how the church is.
she found very much a niche that needed filled, and I'm very glad to see authors doing that and seizing
Yeah.
those opportunities. And of course, I'm going to put your information down in the description box. Don't let me forget to ask you for hers as well, for sure, okay?
Okay.
All right. And we're going to go ahead and sign off here. Did you have anything else you'd like to add before we do so, my dear?
No, I just want to say thank you for taking the time out and listening to me ramble on about my journey. And it's just good to know that what I'm doing is similar to what you and other authors are doing, so that it makes you feel like, I'm not doing something in vain. So
That
thank
is a
you.
big
Thank you for
reason
this
why.
opportunity.
Oh,
Thank you for
you're
the opportunity.
welcome. You're welcome. That's a big part of the reason why I want to do this. So, everybody, thank you so much for joining us today. Check out her books. You see the cover here, Consequences of Crime, Greed, and Love. So, definitely make sure you check her out. And take care, my lovelies. Thank you.
All
Bye.
right, bye-bye.